Hello again, my dear emperors. I'm Marco, and tonight we're drifting into the story of World War I, I guess. Why I guess? Because this isn't your usual history lecture. Here, you don't just observe the past, you become part of it. We speak in second person, we dip into sarcasm, and we blur the line between fact and dream. From the cafes of Sarajevo to the trenches of the Somme, from velvet uniforms to gas masks and telegrams soaked in panic, this story doesn't begin with alliances or treaties. It begins in an open-top car on a sunny morning when a wrong turn and a loaded pistol cracked the world in two. So let the noise of the world fade away, dim the lights, and let me take you back. You are in Sarajevo. It is 1914. You are a driver, probably underpaid, certainly undertrained, and very lost. You're guiding an open-top car. Yes, no roof, because nothing says, "Please assassinate me," like riding slowly through hostile territory, with your face exposed. In the back seat, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie, both dressed to impress, radiating the kind of regal obliviousness only an empire in denial can muster. Crowds line the road. Some are genuinely cheering, others less so. One man, specifically, decides to spice up this royal drive with a hand-thrown grenade. It bounces off the folded-down canopy, rolls under the next car, and explodes there instead. Wrong car, wrong timing. A mix of relief and confusion follows. But the Archduke, ever the bold optimist, or perhaps just the poster child for denial, refuses to cancel the rest of the day's plans. Sophie, bless her, agrees. Hours later, you, the driver, are trying to make up for the lost time. Zigzagging through Sarajevo's inconsistent signage, you take a wrong turn, of course. Why wouldn't you? The car slows down to reverse, and at that moment, fate, fueled by sheer coincidence and cosmic sarcasm, delivers Gavrilo Princip to the sidewalk. He's supposed to be somewhere else, moping with his fellow revolutionaries, nursing a sandwich and existential dread. But here he is, half done with lunch, and there's the Archduke, right in front of him, like a historical piñata on wheels. Princip blinks again, and then draws his pistol. 2 shots. Franz slumps forward. Sophie collapses beside him. History pivots. Now freeze that frame, because that's the moment when everything, the millions dead, the trenches dug, the empires dissolved, stems from a sandwich break and a broken GPS. Franz Ferdinand wasn't particularly beloved by the elite in Vienna. His ideas about reforming the empire, possibly giving Slavs some dignity, made him inconveniently progressive. Still, he was the heir. Killing him wasn't just a murder. It was a match dropped in a basement full of dynamite, lovingly stockpiled over decades. You'd think this would be the moment Europe takes a breath. Maybe Austria-Hungary investigates, perhaps seeks justice through some measured legal framework. Instead, Vienna rolls up its imperial sleeves, flexes its arthritic muscles, and drafts a furious ultimatum to Serbia, knowing full well it wouldn't be accepted. Historians still argue whether Austria genuinely wanted a war or just wanted to look tough. But here's what we do know. Austria had a big brother, a loud, ambitious, spiky-helmeted big brother called Germany. And Germany had just handed Austria a blank check. Not literal money, though that would come later, but a promise. Whatever you do, we got your back. This is the part where you might sigh, maybe even chuckle darkly, because you know what's coming. That serene morning in Sarajevo was never going to stay small. It couldn't, because behind that one man's gun was an empire with something to prove, and behind that empire was another with an inferiority complex and some very detailed plans. Plans involving Belgium, France, and one extremely ill-fated shortcut. But before we march toward trenches and treaties, before the world rearranges itself in blood and bureaucracy, we pause right here at the last moment when it might all have been different. If the driver had taken the correct turn, if the sandwich had taken longer, if Franz Ferdinand had stayed in bed with a mild case of indigestion, Instead, you and I are headed into a storm. But that can wait until the next time you open your eyes. Zoom out, like way out, past the smoke curling from Gavrilo Princip's pistol, past the cobbled streets and startled birds of Sarajevo, out past the Balkans, where half the region has independence in their hearts and vendettas in their bones, out until you can see the full interconnected web of Europe, its powers, its egos, its treaties like dynamite wired together with old Christmas lights. You're now hovering over a very nervous continent. It's 1914, and Europe is the world's most passive-aggressive dinner party. Everyone's smiling, passing the potatoes, and secretly sharpening their knives under the table. Because for decades, countries have been building alliances the way teens form cliques, out of fear, insecurity, and the desperate desire not to get picked last in global dodgeball. First up, we've got the Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Great Britain. They're not exactly besties, but they all share one crucial trait: distrust of Germany. France still simmers over losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War. Russia has ambitions in the Balkans and a protective instinct towards Slavs. And Britain, maritime queen of the world, is deeply allergic to anyone building a navy that might rival hers, like say Germany. Opposite them stands the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. It sounds unified on paper, but in reality, this alliance is the diplomatic equivalent of duct tape holding together a cracked teacup. Germany's the muscle, Austria-Hungary is the ancient grandpa yelling at clouds, and Italy, well, Italy's the friend who's there mostly to borrow sugar and then quietly switch sides when the party gets too intense. And here's the fun part. These alliances are defensive. That is, if one member is attacked, the others are supposed to jump in. Seems sensible, right? Until you realize that one gunshot in Sarajevo just lit the fuse on a Rube Goldberg machine of war declarations. Historians still argue whether these alliances were meant to deter war, or whether they made it inevitable. But when Austria-Hungary decides to confront Serbia, it knows it's rolling the dice. The empire is bloated, fragile, and terrified of slipping further into irrelevance. Serbia, for its part, has nationalism oozing from every pore, and a chip on its shoulder the size of Mount Tara. Now remember that blank check? Germany's assurance that Austria-Hungary could do what it liked without fear of being left hanging. That's where things spiral, because Austria takes this as divine permission to go full drama queen. They craft an ultimatum to Serbia with demands so stringent it's almost comedic. Essentially, let us rewrite your constitution, dismantle your army, and do whatever we want inside your borders. Also, say thank you. To everyone's shock, Serbia says yes to almost all of it. Not just yes, but yes even page 2, which really should have ended things. But Austria-Hungary was already halfway through its We Declare War party banners. Serbia's half-compliance was inconvenient, so Austria pouted, muttered something about principles, and declared war anyway. Boom. That's July 28th, 1914. Now watch as the spiderweb quivers. Russia, the self-appointed big brother of all Slavs, begins to mobilize. Slowly, very slowly. Russia mobilizes like someone looking for their wallet in a department store, loudly, inefficiently, and in a way that alarms everyone nearby. Germany, eye-twitching, demands they stop. Russia, unsurprisingly, does not. So Germany declares war on Russia. And if you're Germany, once you're fighting Russia, you know France will join in. Why? Because France wants revenge. And Paris doesn't need much excuse to dust off those red trousers and start composing stirring military marches. Germany declares war on France too, just to be efficient. Now Britain is watching from across the channel, with its tea and naval superiority, still deciding whether to commit. The tipping point, Germany's brilliant idea to invade France through neutral Belgium. Because who needs subtlety when you can break international law with flair? Britain has a treaty with Belgium, promising to defend its neutrality. More importantly, British leaders need a moral reason to join a war their public isn't sure about. Germany just handed them that reason on a silver platter, with marmalade and a tiny fork. Britain declares war on Germany. Within days, a regional crisis over a dead archduke has spiraled into a continental conflict, and no one is backing down. It's worth noting that not everyone is eager to play. Italy, ever the opportunist, checks the calendar, scratches its chin, and decides it's not quite ready for war. Let's wait and see who's winning, Italy says, backing toward the buffet table. But don't worry, it'll be back, eventually, with dramatics. So now, the players are set. The alliances have activated like cursed amulets, and across Europe, trains begin to fill with young men. They cheer, they wave, they sing songs about glory and honor. Most of them believe this war will be over by Christmas. They're wrong, of course, because Europe's web of alliances didn't just ensure participation, it ensured escalation. Each country pulled in another, each general convinced that speed and surprise would deliver swift victory. What they didn't count on was that everyone else had the same plan. But for now, the mobilization continues. The gears of war turn. Letters are written, uniforms pressed, and generals sharpen pencils over dusty maps, dreaming of glory. And just like that, the age of diplomacy dies quietly, not with a treaty or a compromise, but with trains full of soldiers heading toward a horizon no one fully understands. But what comes next will be even dumber. You are now inside the glittering halls of Viennese power, where brass buttons shine, monocles gleam, and very old men whisper grand plans into each other's well-waxed moustaches. It's July 1914, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire is feeling fragile. Not dying exactly, but definitely not thriving, like a very fancy houseplant that's been overwatered with nationalism and underexposed to modern governance. The empire is a mess, a multi-ethnic, multi-language, multi-everything conglomeration held together by tradition, bureaucracy, and duct tape. So when the heir to the throne gets shot by a Bosnian Serb, it's not just a family tragedy. It's a terrifying reminder that Austria-Hungary's days of bossing around the Balkans might be coming to an end. Now, instead of stepping back to reevaluate, the imperial response is to do the imperial thing, make demands, rattle sabers, and assume everyone will fall in line. But here's the problem. Austria-Hungary isn't exactly what you'd call intimidating. Their army is large on paper, but outdated in strategy and underwhelming in execution. Their empire is like a Baroque opera, grand, slow, and full of awkward pauses. So to make this ultimatum stick, they need backup. Enter Germany. Germany. Young, energetic, a little too eager. The nation-state equivalent of a valedictorian who also happens to be the school bully. Germany doesn't just back Austria, they hand over a metaphorical blank check. Do whatever you need, they say. We've got your back. In fact, here's a pen and a blank war authorization form. Go nuts. Historians still debate how literal Germany intended that check to be. Some argue the Kaiser assumed Austria would act decisively and quickly, either smashing Serbia or reaching a settlement before things escalated. Others say Germany wanted the war, and this was their excuse. What's undeniable is that the blank check made Austria very bold, very quickly. So they draft an ultimatum to Serbia. Not just any ultimatum. This is the diplomatic version of, give us your house keys, your passwords, and permission to redecorate your soul. It demands that Austria be allowed to investigate the assassination from within Serbia, control press coverage, and basically micromanage the country's sovereignty. Now, Serbia is no angel in this story. There's evidence that elements of the Serbian government or military were at least passively aware of the Black Hand plot. But Serbia isn't eager to be turned into a vassal state either. So they do something surprising. They accept almost every term. Almost. There's one clause the intrusive investigation that Serbia cannot or will not accept. They say no, politely, with footnotes. Austria, already halfway into its war boots, takes this as refusal and begins preparing to mobilize. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II is getting nervous. Yes, that Kaiser, the one with the withered arm, the insecurities of a Shakespearean prince, and a moustache that enters rooms 5 minutes before he does. He doesn't actually want a world war, at least not right now. He'd prefer something quick, a controlled explosion, a Balkan spanking, not a global inferno. But his generals? Oh, they have other plans. Germany's military elite have been preparing for this for years. The Schlieffen Plan has been gathering dust in drawers and minds alike. A plan to defeat France quickly by swinging through Belgium like a particularly violent tourist. But that's for later. For now, Germany urges Austria to be swift. Strike fast, make it count before Russia can react. Austria, in its signature style, does the opposite. Bureaucracy bogs everything down. Mobilization is sluggish. Declarations take forever to process. And by the time Austria begins shelling Belgrade on July 28th, it's too late. The moment for a tidy, isolated war has passed. Russia begins to mobilize. This is where things start to spiral, because once Russia mobilizes, Germany panics. And Germany panics with precision. They declare war on Russia. Then they declare war on France. They ready the trains, polish the bayonets, and dust off their invasion routes. But pause here, because this was the moment, the last real chance to stop what's coming. Germany could have held back. Austria could have negotiated. Serbia could have capitulated entirely. But at every point, the actors choose escalation. They all believe the others will back down. They all believe they have the upper hand. None of them do. And here's a quirky fact. Even as war loomed, Europe's stock markets remained relatively calm. That's how unimaginable a full-scale war still seemed. People truly believed that economic interdependence would prevent catastrophe. After all, who'd want to destroy the golden goose of modern trade and finance? Spoiler, everyone wanted to. Because by now, war had become not just inevitable, it had become desirable, a cleansing fire, a way to reset, prove strength, and maybe grab a few strategic borders while no one's looking. Nationalism was high, pride was higher, and underneath it all was a deep, bubbling anxiety that modernity was outpacing the old empires. So the blank check wasn't just a piece of political support, it was a psychological permission slip. It told Austria-Hungary that it was okay to lash out, that Germany would catch them, but neither empire realized how fast the floor was about to vanish beneath them. And as the last diplomatic cables are sent, as the final white-gloved hand signs the war declarations, you can almost hear the gears clunk into place. Across Europe, trains begin to move, not carrying tourists or goods, but soldiers, young men who'd never left their villages, who thought glory meant parades and medals. They would learn differently, but that is a lesson that waits in the mud. The war has officially begun, and you are standing in a train station watching hundreds of young men board carriages with flowers in their hands and songs on their lips. They are waving goodbye to sweethearts, grinning from ear to ear, utterly convinced that they'll be home before the leaves fall. It's like the world's worst field trip, sponsored by delusion and hubris. Germany moves first. It's the chess master, with one very specific opening, the Schlieffen Plan, named after General Alfred von Schlieffen, who once said something like, "We'll just knock out France really fast and then jog over to fight Russia, no big deal." The idea was simple. On paper, Germany would avoid the strong French defences on the Franco-German border by cutting through Belgium, a neutral nation with little interest in this mess. Why fight through a brick wall when you can crash through your neighbour's window instead? Now, if Germany had asked Belgium nicely, maybe things would have gone differently. But Germany doesn't do nice. It does ultimatums. It tells Belgium, let us through, or else. And Belgium bless its chocolate-loving, stubborn heart, says no. So Germany does what it does best, invades. On August 4th, 1914, German troops march into Belgium, expecting a casual stroll. Instead, they are met with fierce resistance. Belgium floods its own fields to stall the German advance. Fortresses hold longer than expected. The mighty German war machine, finely tuned and freshly polished, finds itself bogged down by courage and mud. This is Germany's first mistake, a big one, because now Britain, who'd been awkwardly hovering at the edge of the party, suddenly has a reason to jump in. They had promised to defend Belgium's neutrality, and even though treaties are often treated like expired coupons, this one sticks. On August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany, and just like that, a regional war becomes a full-on European brawl. But Germany isn't worried. Not yet. They have their timetable. Trains are running on time. Troops are marching. Paris is just a few 100 kilometers away. The plan is unfolding. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. First, the Belgians delay them. Then the British Expeditionary Force lands, small but professional, and throws a few wrenches into the German gears. French forces, despite wearing uniforms better suited for a Renaissance fair, bright red pants, blue coats, and the kind of hats that scream "shoot here," also rally faster than expected, and while they're initially pushed back, they don't break. Germany advances deep into France. The cities tremble, civilians flee, and by early September they're within 40 miles of Paris, close enough to smell the pastries. But war, as it turns out, is exhausting. German troops are tired, their supply lines stretched like old socks. The plan assumed quick victories, not stubborn resistance. And then something peculiar happens. The French regroup. At the Marne River, French and British forces find a weak spot in the German advance, a gap in the lines. It's small, but it's there. And into that gap they pour everything: horses, infantry, taxis full of soldiers. Yes, Parisian taxis literally ferried troops to the front in a bizarre and strangely charming logistical miracle. The result is the First Battle of the Marne. It's loud, it's chaotic, and it's the moment the war changes shape. The Germans are stunned. Their great plan, the Schlieffen masterpiece, unravels. They retreat. Not all the way, but enough. They dig in along the Eisner River and start building trenches. The Allies, sensing an opportunity, try to outflank them. The Germans do the same. This goes on and on in what historians romantically call the race to the sea, though it's less of a race and more of a series of awkward sidesteps and muddy faceplants. Each time one side tries to outmaneuver the other, they dig more trenches. Soon there's a continuous line of fortified misery stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And just like that, trench warfare is born. Now, pause here for a moment. Imagine being a general in 1914. You were trained in 19th century tactics. You believe in cavalry charges, heroic offensives, and the spirit of the bayonet. But now, your men are stuck in ditches. The enemy is 100 yards away, invisible, behind barbed wire and machine guns. If you order a charge, they die. If you don't, morale dies. Historians still argue whether military leaders adapted too slowly or whether there were just no good options. Either way, the war is now frozen in place. The great sweeping maneuvers are gone. In their place, mud, blood, and a sense of grim permanence. You're a soldier in this new world. The sky is grey. The trench smells like mould and regret. Rats scurry over your boots. Your friend hasn't changed socks in weeks. Shells explode every night, like thunder without rain. You sleep sitting up. You dream of bread. You write letters home and censor your own horrors because you don't want your mother to worry. Meanwhile, your commanding officer still believes that victory is just one big push away, that with enough artillery, enough courage, you can storm the enemy trench and win the day. Spoiler, you can't. Not really. The Germans reinforce. The French counter. The British dig deeper, and the front, now solidified, begins to consume lives by the thousands. For every foot gained, hundreds die. Still, the generals keep planning. The war will not end this year. It won't even slow down. It has found its rhythm now. Slow, grinding, industrial. It's not about glory anymore. It's about endurance. And all of this slow, thunderous descent into stalemate, stems from one moment, a plan written in peace that didn't survive the first punch of war. But there's still the Eastern Front to consider, and there, oh boy, things are just getting spicy. So while Western Europe is busy digging its own grave in slow motion, you drift eastward, where things are less about stalemates and more about spectacular flops. Russia, glorious Mother Russia, has joined the party, and unlike the punctual Germans or the calculating French, Russia approaches war with a certain improvisational flair. Mobilization, not bad. Strategic planning, supply chains. We don't talk about those, but the one thing Russia has in abundance is people, millions of them, all marching westward in boots of questionable quality, and with rifles they sometimes have to share. They're coming for both Germany and Austria-Hungary, and at first it seems like they might be a real threat. 2 Russian armies charge into East Prussia in August 1914, hoping to knock Germany off balance before its Western Front wraps up. It's bold, it's fast, it's also deeply, irreversibly flawed. Why? Because the 2 Russian armies don't coordinate at all. It's like watching 2 toddlers try to build IKEA furniture using different manuals and an aggressive sense of confidence. One general, Rennenkampf, marches stiffly from the north. The other, Samsonov, lumbers up from the south. And between them, the German 8th Army, now under the control of a dynamic duo, Paul von Hindenburg, who looks like a Prussian woodcarving brought to life, and Erich Ludendorff, whose job is to get things done while Hindenburg scolds impressively. The Germans do something shocking. They abandon most of East Prussia, fall back, lure the Russians in. Then when Samsonov's army is isolated and overextended, they pivot and pounce. It's called the Battle of Tannenberg, and it's not even close. The Germans crush the southern Russian force so thoroughly that Samsonov disappears into the woods and never comes back. Some say he took his own life, others say he simply couldn't face the music or the telegrams. It's one of the worst defeats in Russian military history, but it's not the last. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary, already wobbly from decades of internal bickering and over-polished epaulets, decides to prove it still has a spine. It launches its own offensive into Serbia. Yes, Serbia, the little Balkan country that started this whole mess. Austria wants revenge. It wants closure. It wants to show Germany that it's still a relevant empire. So it sends in troops, marches into rugged mountainous terrain, and immediately gets beaten back. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The Serbs, despite being outnumbered, under-equipped, and running on stubborn nationalism and black coffee, hold their ground. They use the mountains, they use ambushes, and they use their knowledge of the terrain. Austria, meanwhile, forgets to bring competent leadership and winter coats. The result, embarrassment. The kind of military faceplant that causes awkward silences in diplomatic parlours. Historians still argue whether Austria's early failures were due to poor planning, underestimation of Serbia, or just the general entropy of empires past their prime. But the outcome is clear. Austria needs help. Germany rolls its eyes and sighs heavily, like someone being asked to fix the family printer again. And so while Germany tries to juggle 2 fronts, it realizes something important. Its allies are more liabilities than assets. Austria's struggling in the Balkans. The Ottomans are still warming up. And Italy, remember, is still at the punch bowl, pretending not to notice the war happening in the living room. Back to Russia. After Tannenberg, you might think they'd retreat and rethink, but no. They keep pressing forward in Galicia against Austria-Hungary, and there they do better. Austria is weaker than Germany, and Russian forces manage to win some battles and capture territory. The region becomes a seesaw of offensives and counter-offensives, with thousands of soldiers dying in the mud, and the borders moving back and forth like an indecisive toddler rearranging puzzle pieces. And all this time, Germany is realizing a terrible truth. The two-front war they always feared is now reality. Their Schlieffen plan failed. France wasn't knocked out quickly. Russia wasn't slow and weak. And now they're sandwiched, just like every German general's worst-case scenario predicted. Still, the Germans have one thing going for them. They're efficient, cold, brutal, and precise. They learn from Tannenberg. They adapt. They dig trenches where needed. They move troops by rail like they're playing chess with human pieces. And they hold the Eastern Front together, even as Austria flounders and Russian numbers swell. But here's the kicker. None of this stops the war from escalating. New fronts keep opening. Old ones refuse to close. Every victory is Pyrrhic, every advance temporary. And no one, not even the victors of these early battles, feels like they're winning, because they're not really. They're surviving, barely. And while soldiers die by the thousands, politicians still cling to hopes of swift conclusions. They still believe that, with the right push, the enemy will fold. They still talk about home by Christmas in hushed, hopeful tones. But the truth is, the war has outgrown their fantasies. It's no longer a matter of treaties and honor. It's a machine now, a meat grinder with a taste for empire. And the grinder's only just begun to hum. You're standing in Istanbul, depending on who you ask and when you ask it. The scent of cardamom and coal smoke lingers in the air as minarets rise over a city that once crowned empires. But now, in the shadows of warships and whispers, the Ottoman Empire is deciding whether to jump into the fire. The Ottomans are old, not quaintly so, but ancient institution tired. Once the terror of Europe, now the slightly wheezy man at the table, still holding a title, but missing several teeth. They've been called the sick man of Europe for decades, which is both unkind and unfortunately accurate. And yet, when Germany comes knocking in 1914, the Ottomans answer the door. Now, you might think they'd be reluctant to sign up for a war, already slipping into trench-stagnated madness. But the Ottomans have their reasons, none of them especially good, but all painfully human. They've lost territory recently in the Balkan Wars. Their army, though creaky, has been reorganized under German advisors, and most importantly, they want to matter again, to prove they're not a relic. Germany knows this, so they make promises, influence, resources, and maybe, just maybe, a shot at reclaiming some of that lost imperial swagger. So in a move that surprises exactly no one who's been watching the imperial chessboard, the Ottomans bombard Russian ports on the Black Sea in October 19, not because they had to, but because they really wanted to be noticed. Russia, delighted to be insulted and already involved in 3 wars, promptly declares war back. Britain and France follow suit, and just like that, the war spreads again. Like ink soaking through silk, the Ottoman Empire has entered the fray. Historians still debate whether this was a strategic necessity or a midlife crisis in empire form. What's certain is that it turned a European conflict into something far broader. See, with the Ottomans involved, the war now touches the Middle East directly. Britain, already nervous about the security of its precious oil supplies and access to India, starts eyeing the region like a man checking if his wallet is still there. And the Ottomans, they start dreaming, grand dreams, of retaking Egypt, of stirring Muslim uprisings in British and French colonies, of being the caliphate that strikes back. But first, they look eastward toward the Caucasus. There, in the frosted mountains, the Ottomans mount a winter offensive against Russia. It's called the Battle of Sarikamish, and well, let's just say it makes Tannenberg look like a well-organized picnic. Picture it. Tens of thousands of poorly equipped Ottoman soldiers marching through snowdrifts in thin uniforms, trying to outmaneuver Russian forces in terrain better suited for mountain goats. The weather, predictably, has other plans. Soldiers freeze, supplies vanish, command collapses. It is an utter disaster. But from this failure emerges something darker. Frustrated and seeking scapegoats, the Ottoman leadership begins to look inward, specifically toward its Armenian population, Christian, historically autonomous, and accused of sympathizing with the Russians. And so in 1915, the Ottoman Empire begins what many will later call the Armenian Genocide. Villages are emptied, marches begin, men are executed, women and children are sent into the desert with no provisions. Somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians die. It's a horror that still echoes in diplomatic debates and historical reckonings to this day. Meanwhile, on a different part of the map, Britain is eyeing the Ottoman Dardanelles Strait, the narrow channel between Europe and Asia, and a critical bottleneck for supplies to Russia. Controlling it could change the war, so someone in London says, hey, what if we just took it? Enter the Dardanelles campaign, also known by its more famous name, Gallipoli. Here's the plan as imagined by Winston Churchill. Yes, that Winston. A grand naval assault followed by a swift invasion. The Turks won't see it coming. It'll be like stealing baklava from a sleepy bazaar. Only they do see it coming. The initial naval attacks in early 1915 are repelled. The Allies then try a land invasion using British, French, Australian and New Zealand troops, Anzacs as they'll come to be known. These men land on beaches that sound pleasant. Anzac Cove, Cape Helles, but become synonymous with heat, flies, mud and blood. The campaign becomes a slog, steep cliffs, well-dug Turkish defences, and poor Allied planning turn the operation into another static nightmare. Months go by, nothing is gained, thousands die. The only thing the Allies manage to pull off successfully? The evacuation. It's one of the few clean retreats in military history, carried out so stealthily that the Turks don't notice for days. And so the Dardanelles campaign ends, not with glory, but with sighs, funerals, and a tarnished Churchill. Meanwhile, far from the trenches, a different kind of war is unfolding in Africa. European colonies are dragged into the fray. Because why wouldn't they be? Germany has outposts in places like Togo, Cameroon, and German East Africa. Britain and France launch expeditions to seize them. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it's absurdly difficult, involving months of jungle warfare and troops who had never once signed up to fight for European empires in a conflict that doesn't even affect their village. Historians still argue whether this truly made it a world war, or whether it was just imperialism, being its usual greedy self under new branding. Either way, the war is global now. Every front bleeds, every map is redrawn. And all of it, every shell, every decision, every cold and hungry march is adding up. Because the world, as it turns out, isn't very good at limited war. And it's even worse at stopping one once it starts. By now, you might be thinking, surely this can't get worse. Surely after failed offensives, diplomatic dominoes, and trench warfare that smells like damp socks marinated in fear, someone will blink, someone will call it off, right? No, you're adorable. Instead, 1915 becomes the year of attrition, a polite military term for let's keep doing the same thing and expect different results. The Western Front, that long scar slicing across France and Belgium, turns from a battlefield into a meat grinder, and the strategy that defines it, going over the top. Ah yes, that phrase, so innocuous, so British, so fatal. Here's how it works. You dig trenches. You wait. You launch an artillery barrage to soften up the enemy which mostly rearranges the mud and makes a lot of noise. Then, when the dust settles, you send wave after wave of infantrymen loaded down with rifles, bayonets, and occasional hope straight across no man's land. The goal? Reach the enemy trench and somehow survive the journey. The reality? Barbed wire, machine guns, craters the size of tax offices, and an enemy who's been drinking tea and polishing their rifles for this exact moment. It doesn't go well. Yet commanders, lacking better ideas and drunk on Napoleonic dreams, keep ordering these assaults, over and over. Entire battalions vanish in the space of a morning, and if that weren't enough, a new horror enters the scene: gas. Specifically, chlorine gas, green, ghostly, and entirely indiscriminate. At the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, the Germans unleash it on French colonial troops. The cloud drifts, slow and silent. Soldiers think it's a morning mist until it hits. Lungs burn, eyes blister, men choke and fall. Panic spreads faster than the gas itself. And here's the kicker. The Germans hadn't really planned on what to do after the gas worked. They hadn't prepared for a breakthrough, so they watched their own horrifying invention succeed and then fail to exploit it. Gas warfare will return, of course. Phosgene, mustard gas, gas masks with goggles that fog and rubber that cracks. But this first use changes everything. It confirms what soldiers already fear, that the war is evolving faster than their ability to survive it. Meanwhile, behind the lines, letters home grow darker, trenches flood, rats breed, shell shock, what we now call PTSD, sets in. Men begin to break, not from bullets, but from the waiting, from the dread, from the knowledge that their lives are being spent like pennies in a broken vending machine. Historians still argue whether any of these early offensives had a chance. Some say they were necessary to relieve pressure on allies, others that they were just bureaucratic momentum in uniform. What's clear is this: by the end of 1915, no side has gained more than a few miles, and both have lost hundreds of thousands. But wait, let's not forget the other fronts. In the east, Russia is struggling. After a few wins against Austria-Hungary, they suffer defeats at the hands of the better organized Germans. Supply lines falter, ammunition runs low. In some sectors, Russian soldiers go into battle without rifles, told to pick up weapons from the dead. And inside Russia, something begins to curdle. The Tsar, Nicholas II, still believes he's been anointed by God. His wife Alexandra increasingly listens to Rasputin, a mystic with questionable hygiene and an uncanny ability to survive assassination attempts. The Russian people, meanwhile, are cold, hungry, and increasingly angry. It's not a revolution yet, but the ground is cracking. Meanwhile, Italy finally decides to show up. Remember, it was part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But Italy took one look at this family feud and said, "No thanks, we'll wait." Now, however, the Allies offer a better deal: land, influence, recognition. Italy, never one to ignore a well-wrapped bribe, joins the war in May 1915 against its former allies. And what does Italy do? Well, it charges up some mountains. Literally. Italy's main front is against Austria-Hungary in the Alps. High altitudes, steep cliffs, and freezing temperatures. Think war reenacted by goats on steroids. They fight a dozen battles along the Isonzo River. Spoiler, most end in draw, frostbite, or both. It's brave, yes. It's also futile. In short, the year 1915 becomes one long lesson in how not to wage war. From Gallipoli's misfires to the Western Front's suicidal optimism, from gas clouds to alpine avalanches, it's a parade of pain, mismanagement, and disillusionment. And through it all, something odd begins to happen in the minds of the soldiers. The glory fades. The patriotism cools. What remains is something quieter, harder, a camaraderie born not from flags or speeches, but from surviving the same nightmare. You and the man next to you, both crawling through the same mud, both waiting for a letter or a bullet, whichever comes first. The war is stuck. Europe is exhausted. The year is now 1916, and everyone is still pretending like this might end if they just try one more big offensive. It's kind of sweet, in the way watching someone kick a vending machine over and over, hoping for a different result, is sweet if the vending machine were full of mustard gas and your friends kept dying every time you pressed C5. Let's start with Germany, who's got a new plan to break France. Not with strategy or surprise. No, those are so 1914. This time the plan is psychological. Enter General Erich von Falkenhayn, a man who believes the key to victory is to bleed the French army dry. His logic? Pick a place so symbolic, so emotionally loaded, that the French will defend it at all costs, even if it kills them. A place with history, pride, and maximum melodrama. He chooses Verdun. Verdun is one of those names that sounds harmless to the modern ear, like a brand of mineral water, but to the French it's sacred ground. It has forts, hills, and enough historical baggage to qualify as emotional blackmail. Falkenhayn launches the assault in February 1916. The battle becomes a months-long nightmare. The German artillery begins by turning entire forests into matchsticks. Then come the infantry waves. The French dig in. They rotate divisions constantly, one in, one out, to keep morale from snapping. The motto becomes, "They shall not pass," which sounds heroic until you realize that nobody's really passing anything anymore except gas and trauma. And Verdun doesn't just bleed France. It bleeds Germany too. Falkenhayn assumed the French would suffer disproportionately. He forgot that in trench warfare everyone loses. Casualties mount on both sides. Over 300,000 dead, nearly 800,000 wounded. For what? A few hills, a few forts, and the satisfaction of not backing down. Historians still argue if Verdun was strategic brilliance or catastrophic arrogance. Either way, it sets a gruesome precedent. The war is no longer about movement. It's about endurance. Whose men will break first? Whose will run out? But Britain isn't about to let France hog all the trauma. They've been planning their own big push along the Somme River. It's meant to relieve pressure on Verdun. It's also meant to show off Britain's newest industrial toy, the tank. Let's not get too excited. These first tanks are slow, prone to breakdowns, and about as stealthy as a pub brawl. But they exist, and that's new. The real star of the Somme, though, is artillery. The British pound the German lines for days before the infantry advance. The theory is elegant. Blow up everything, then walk in like you're picking up groceries. The reality? The shelling fails to destroy deep German bunkers. Barbed wire remains. And when British troops go over the top on July 1st, 1916, they walk, yes, walk, into machine gun fire. It becomes the single worst day in British military history. Nearly 60,000 casualties in one day. And the battle isn't over. It grinds on until November. Men fight over villages that sound like fairy tale settings. Thiepval, Delville Wood, Highwood, until those places are nothing but craters and teeth. The Allies gain about 6 miles, at a cost of over 1 million casualties combined. But let's switch fronts for a moment, because Russia, surprisingly, isn't quite finished. Enter General Alexei Brusilov, one of the few commanders in this war who understands that repeating the same failed tactics is perhaps not ideal. He launches the Brusilov offensive in June 1916, using surprise attacks and creeping artillery barrages. It's the most successful Russian operation of the war. Austria-Hungary is shredded. Entire armies collapse. The Central Powers panic. It's a genuine breakthrough. But like most things in this war, it doesn't last. Russia lacks the reserves to exploit it. Germany sends reinforcements. The offensive slows, then halts. Still, it proves that innovation can work if you've got the bodies and bullets to follow through. Meanwhile, deep in German offices and smoky war rooms, a new concern emerges: the blockade. Britain has been choking Germany with a naval blockade since the war began. It's working. Food shortages grow. Civilians suffer. Riots spark. The government starts rationing turnips as a miracle food. Turnips, as if that's going to win anyone over. So Germany, desperate to retaliate, returns to an old idea: unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats start sinking, merchant ships, civilian ships, basically anything that floats and smells vaguely allied. It's brutal, it's effective. It's also not great for public relations, especially when American citizens are among the dead. Because yes, America is watching. They're not in the war yet, but their eyebrows are officially raised. And as Europe turns darker, colder, more hopeless, something new begins to stir: doubt. In the hearts of soldiers, in the minds of civilians, even in the smoke-filled halls of governments that once spoke only in certainty. The war is no longer about victory. It's about not losing. And no one, not Germany, not Britain, not France, not Russia, is sure how much longer they can keep that up. Picture yourself somewhere along the Western Front. It's late 1916. You're waist-deep in mud that hasn't dried since the spring of last year. Your socks have become fossils, and the guy next to you has started talking to his biscuits. The war, now in its third year, is like a bad dream no one can wake up from. A grinding loop of shellfire, whispers, and letters from home that sound increasingly unreal. And just when you think things couldn't possibly get any stranger, a horn sounds in the distance. Not a bugle, not an officer's bark, something deeper, a low, rumbling growl from beyond the mist. You squint, you see it. A tank. It lurches forward like a drunken tortoise with anger issues. Steam hisses from its sides. Metal plates clank with every turn. It's not fast. It's not reliable. And when it breaks down, which it will, the men inside will be as stuck as you are. But it's here. It's new. And more importantly, it's terrifying to anyone who didn't get the memo that war has now officially entered the mechanical age. Welcome to industrialized warfare, version 2.0. You already met the machine gun and the gas cloud. Now meet the tank, the aeroplane, and the big, big guns. Everything is heavier, everything is louder, and everything is designed to turn humans into statistics more efficiently. But before we zoom in on the machinery, let's widen the lens again, because while the Western Front is swallowing men and machines by the hour, the rest of the world isn't sleeping. Let's go east, where the Russian bear is once again licking its wounds. The Brusilov offensive from earlier this year gave everyone a jolt, but now the Russian army is exhausted, not just in terms of supplies or morale, though those are abysmal, but in terms of belief. Belief in the system, belief in the Tsar, belief that any of this is worth dying in a trench for. The Russian people are starving. Bread riots turn into political protests. And all the while, back in the palace, Rasputin, the mystic with eyes like spilled ink and a beard that could house a small family of sparrows, is still whispering into the Empress's ear. Historians still argue how much power Rasputin really had. Some say he was the puppet master of the empire. Others say he was just a charismatic conman with weird luck. But one thing is certain: the people hate him. They see him as a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. And in December 1916, a group of nobles decides to fix the problem with poison, bullets, and finally a river. Because when you're dealing with Rasputin, one method of murder isn't enough. Still, the damage is done. The monarchy is bleeding legitimacy faster than it's losing battles. Revolution is coming. Not yet, but soon. Meanwhile, in Romania, the war gets a new contestant. Romania joins the Allies in August 1916, convinced the timing is right to grab some Austro-Hungarian land while it's down. Spoiler, the timing is not right. Germany and Austria launch a counter-offensive so fast that Romanian troops barely have time to check their maps. By the end of the year, Bucharest falls. Another front, another failure. And yet the Central Powers aren't celebrating. Why? Because victory doesn't feel like anything anymore. Not joy, not relief, just the faint hope that maybe this new trench, this new city, this new strategy will bring the war 1 inch closer to ending. Let's circle back to the British. After the bloodbath of the Somme, there's a shake-up. General Douglas Haig remains in command, but doubts are growing louder. He's convinced the war can be won with enough pushing, enough artillery, enough tanks. It's the military version of banging your head against a wall, because one day you're sure the wall will move. So the British begin to invest in industry. More tanks, better guns. They study logistics like a religion. The French do the same. Everyone is learning, but learning slowly. Because learning in this war means experimenting with real lives, and failing is measured in cemeteries. Meanwhile, Germany is building something else. Submarines. The U-boat strategy is simple. Starve Britain, sink supply ships, create chaos on the seas, and for a while it works. Merchant vessels go down, insurance premiums go up, the Atlantic turns into a graveyard. But this strategy has a downside. Remember the Lusitania, the civilian ship Germany sank back in 1915, killing over 100 Americans. That memory is still fresh in the US, and more importantly, the US is watching, still neutral, technically, still hoping to avoid the mess, but each shipwreck nudges the needle. And then there's another problem, Germany's allies. Austria-Hungary is still stumbling through the Balkans. The Ottomans are bogged down by Arab revolts and British raids, and Bulgaria, while trying its best, is not exactly a game changer. Germany is the adult in the room, carrying the war on its shoulders, and those shoulders are starting to sag. Internally, Germany is suffering. The British blockade is working. Food shortages are real. The turnip winter of 1916-17 hits hard. German civilians are cold, hungry, and increasingly bitter. The war promised glory. It delivered ration cards. You, sitting in a trench, cleaning your rifle with fingers that haven't felt warmth in weeks, wonder if anyone remembers what the war was about in the first place. A duke was shot. All of this for that. And so 1916 ends, not with a bang or a treaty, but with a long, cold sigh. The world is trapped in a conflict that everyone hates, but no one knows how to stop. And 1917, oh, you haven't even met 1917 yet. But don't worry, it's coming. Welcome to 1917. You wake up in the trench again. Your breath forms fog in the frozen air. Your boots are heavier with mud than they are with feet. You scratch your head and find not thoughts, but lice. And yet the dawn brings something different. Not hope, not really, but movement. Something in the gears of history has begun to shift. Because 1917, unlike the years before it, isn't content with being more of the same. No, 1917 wants drama, revolutions, declarations, betrayals. The war, already a grotesque theatre, is about to get a new cast and a new script. Let's start with Russia, because Russia doesn't do anything by halves. Starvation is rising, morale is plunging. Soldiers desert not just by the dozen, but by the thousand. And Tsar Nicholas II, he's still pretending everything's fine, even as his people storm bakeries for bread made out of sawdust. So the people rise. In Petrograd, crowds of women, workers, and soldiers fill the streets in March. Peace, bread, and down with the Tsar, they shout. Within days, the mutiny spreads. The army, bless its cold, tired soul, refuses to fire on its own citizens. Nicholas II, stunned and abandoned, abdicates the throne. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule ends not with a bullet, but a shrug. A provisional government takes over. Liberal, democratic, hopeful. They promise elections, freedom, reform, but most importantly, they promise to keep fighting the war. Historians still argue whether this was the government's greatest mistake or just their most immediate suicide note, because the Russian people didn't revolt to continue dying in trenches. They wanted out, and someone with a tiny beard and a giant ambition was listening. His name is Vladimir Lenin, exiled in Switzerland, sipping theoretical communism with a twist of conspiracy. Lenin sees his chance. With German help, yes really, he's smuggled back into Russia aboard a sealed train. Why would Germany help their enemy? Simple, they want Russia to collapse. A civil war in Russia means fewer Russian soldiers on the front lines. It's the geopolitical version of lighting your neighbor's house on fire because you don't like his mailbox. Lenin arrives in Petrograd and immediately starts sowing dissent. Peace, land, bread, that's his slogan. Simple, punchy, digestible. It spreads like wildfire. But before we jump ahead to the October Revolution, let's sail across the Atlantic, where America is finally making up its mind. Until now, the US has stayed out of the war, watching from its isolated recliner, while Europe tore itself apart. President Woodrow Wilson campaigned on peace. He called it a war to end all wars, which, in hindsight, is adorable. But in January 1917, Germany makes a bold, baffling decision. They resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Why? Because the British blockade is starving Germany. They need to break the stalemate. Sinking merchant ships might just force Britain to surrender. The cost possibly dragging America into the war. But the Germans gamble. We'll win before the Americans arrive. Bold, misguided, incredibly German. Then comes the Zimmermann telegram. Arthur Zimmermann, Germany's foreign secretary, sends a coded message to Mexico suggesting that if the US joins the war, Mexico should invade them. In return, Mexico would get Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico back. Spoiler, the British intercept the message. They decode it. They show it to Wilson. Americans are outraged. You can poke our ships, maybe, but you don't try to pawn off our southwestern states like monopoly properties. That's the line. So in April 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. Now, it's important to note, America is not ready for war. Its army is small. Its generals still wear spurs and monocles. Its soldiers train with broomsticks instead of rifles. But America has two things that matter, money and industry, and both begin to flow across the Atlantic like a tidal wave. Meanwhile, back in France, the French army is not okay. The Nivelle offensive, launched in April, is supposed to be the big one, a breakthrough, a turning point. Instead, it's a meat grinder with a French accent. The men, already weary from years of senseless charges, reach their breaking point. They mutiny. Not all at once, not with flags or slogans, but entire divisions refuse to attack. They'll hold the line, they say, but no more running into machine guns for generals sipping cognac in chateaux. The French government panics. They shuffle command, bring in General Philippe Pétain, a man of patience, not glory. He calms the troops. No mass punishments, just food, rest, and the promise that the madness will end soon. Historians still debate whether this was the moment the war could have collapsed entirely. Had the Germans known how deep the mutiny ran, they might have pressed harder, but they didn't, and France, battered but unbroken, holds. In Britain, David Lloyd George replaces Asquith as Prime Minister. He centralises war production, expands the navy, and prepares for America's arrival, like a host tidying up before the rich guests show up. And the Ottomans, still entrenched in the Middle East, British and Arab forces, led by the ever-dashing T.E. Lawrence, begin pushing up through Palestine. The Ottoman dream of reclaiming its empire is quietly turning to dust in the desert wind. So now the board is set. Russia teeters toward revolution. America steps into the ring. France bleeds, but survives. Germany tightens its grip, even as it starts to feel its own hunger. And somewhere beneath all this, hope flickers. Faint, foolish, but still there, the hope that maybe the next year will be the last. So the stage is set, the empires are trembling, the trenches are weeping, and the world has officially welcomed a fresh-faced newcomer, the United States of America. You, dear soldier, are still ankle-deep in mud, but now your letters are joined by those of eager young lads from Kansas and Brooklyn, writing home about the wonders of French bread and how weirdly loud the frogs are at night. But while America is getting dressed for war, Russia decides to change outfits entirely, and not in a subtle spring collection way. No, this is full-scale revolutionary couture. It's October 1917, and the Russian Provisional Government, those poor idealists who thought democracy could survive in a war zone, has run out of steam. The people are done. The soldiers are done. Even the police are like, you know what? Let's see what the bearded guy has to say. And that guy, of course, is Lenin. He and the Bolsheviks seize power in what is arguably the least dramatic storming in history. No mass firefight, just a lot of walking into buildings and politely asking guards to leave. They take over Petrograd, they announce themselves as the new government, and almost immediately they offer peace. Lenin's logic is simple. We need bread, we need land, but most of all, we need to stop bleeding men into this imperial dumpster fire. So he sends envoys to Germany, hat in hand, and begins negotiating what will become the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now Germany is thrilled. A one-front war? Finally? Yes, please. But there's a catch. This treaty demands that Russia give up a lot of land. Like we won't even fit on the map after this levels of land. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, all gone. It's one of the most lopsided peace treaties ever signed, and even some Germans raise an eyebrow. Are we the baddies? They whisper. No, just efficient, someone replies. Back in the West, the Allies are livid. Russia's exit means Germany can shift troops from the Eastern Front to the West. Suddenly, the trenches in France are getting a lot more crowded, and the mood grows darker than a gas mask's interior. But don't worry, because here come the Americans. Yes, America has declared war. Yes, they've begun shipping troops. But the US Army in 1917 is not the globe-striding superpower you might imagine. They're still learning how to handle trench warfare. Many don't have helmets. Some don't even have rifles. But what they do have is energy, optimism, and fresh supplies. And boy, do the Allies need them. Britain is running low on men, on food, on patience. So is France. Civilians in both countries are growing restless. Air raids, rationing, endless casualty lists. They grind people down. And when the Germans begin bombing cities with zeppelins and long-range cannons, even sleep becomes political. This is also the year that technology truly begins to reshape the battlefield. Tanks become less ridiculous. Aircraft start dogfighting, like skyborne pirates. Pilots are no longer just scouts. They're dueling heroes, barons of the air. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, soars above the carnage, his scarlet triplane a blur of death and decorum. He's both myth and machine, and when he's eventually shot down in 1918, entire nations pause to take note. Back on the ground, General Haig, yes, still around, launches yet another offensive, this time in Passchendaele. Ah, Passchendaele. Even the name sounds like something soggy and unpleasant, and it lives up to the reputation. Rain turns the battlefield into a swamp. Soldiers drown in mud. Artillery shells vanish into the muck without exploding. The entire campaign becomes an exercise in slow-motion despair. By the end, Britain gains a few miles, at the cost of over 500,000 casualties. Historians still debate whether it was worth it. Some say it helped exhaust the Germans. Others say it just exhausted everyone equally. Meanwhile, down south, the Italians are having a rough go at the Battle of Caporetto. Austria-Hungary, bolstered by German divisions, launches a surprise attack. The Italian front collapses like a soufflé in a thunderstorm. Entire divisions retreat. Thousands surrender. It's a national humiliation and a rallying cry. Italy regroups. With help from the Allies, they dig in again. So by the end of 1917, here's where we are. Russia is out. America is in. Germany is stronger, but starving. Britain and France are still standing, but swaying slightly. The war, once so full of nationalist bravado, has become something else. Not a crusade, not a defense of honor, but a test of who can outlast the others. It's not about glory anymore. It's about survival. And now, with 1918 cracking open like a stale ration biscuit, Germany sees its chance. Russia's gone. The Eastern Front is quiet. For the first time in years, German generals don't have to split their lunch and their army between two very angry neighbors. So what do? They gamble hard. It's called the Ludendorff Offensive, named after Germany's quartermaster general, Erich Ludendorff, a man whose moustache is outpaced only by his appetite for dramatic maneuvers. He believes that the only way to win the war is to end it now, before America's full force arrives like a sleep-deprived elephant with too many guns. So in March 1918, Germany unleashes everything. Stormtroopers, elite infantry trained in speed and infiltration, sprint across no man's land, bypassing strong points and sowing chaos in the rear. Artillery rains down, not in hours-long barrages, but in sudden, deafening bursts. Poison gas drifts where it's least expected. This isn't trench warfare anymore. This is Blitzkrieg's clumsy grandfather learning to walk. And it works. Oh, it works. The Allies are caught off guard. Entire sectors crumble. British and French lines stretch and twist like wet spaghetti. German troops surge forward, capturing more ground in a few weeks than they had in years. For a dizzying moment, Paris is once again in sight. So close German artillery begins shelling it from 80 miles away, using a monstrous gun nicknamed the Paris gun. Accuracy, questionable. Morale impact, devastating. But, and you knew a but was coming. Success is deceptive, because the German army is sprinting on fumes. Supply lines stretch, troops outrun their own logistics, and crucially, Germany has no trucks, no motorways, no fresh reserves. Every advance weakens their core. The Allies, on the other hand, are bruised, but breathing. And more importantly, they've got backup. Here come the Americans. Real ones this time. Not just uniforms and chewing gum, but full divisions, arriving in France by the thousands. Doughboys, they're called. Young, wide-eyed, and disturbingly clean. They may not know the difference between a trench and a ditch, but they have energy, they have weapons, they have food, and they're here to stay. The first major American engagement is at Cantigny in May 19. It's a small operation, strategically minor, but symbolically enormous. The Americans prove they can fight and win. From there they throw themselves into the defense at Château Thierry and Belleau Wood, helping stop the German advance. Belleau Wood is brutal. Close quarters, bayonets, grenades, forests turned into charred skeletons. But the Marines hold. They charge, and in one infamous instance, they fight hand to hand in the shattered roots of trees that once held birds, not bullets. Meanwhile, behind German lines, something far more dangerous than any bullet begins to spread. Hunger, despair, whispers. Germany's people are starving. The British blockade has done its job. Bread is scarce, meat is myth, coal is running low, and the illusion of victory, the dream that this was all worth it, begins to crack. Even the German high command sees it. Ludendorff, once a firebrand, now rants about traitors and Jews and communists. He's unraveling. Kaiser Wilhelm II is barely holding on. His generals know it, his people know it, and perhaps most tragically, even he knows it. The Allied counterattack begins in earnest in the summer. Fresh American troops pour in. French and British divisions, rearmed and reinforced, go on the offensive. And Germany starts retreating, not all at once, not in a panic, but steadily, irrevocably. The Hindenburg Line, once thought impenetrable, begins to fall. Towns and trenches change hands. The Allies reclaim ground lost in 1914. Every day, Germany bleeds more. Troops, morale, hope. And then, like a magician removing his own hat, Ludendorff resigns. The German government scrambles. They form a new one, less militaristic, more civilian. They begin whispering about peace, not because they want to, but because they have to. The war isn't just unwinnable now, it's catastrophic. In early November, sailors in the German Navy mutiny. They refuse to go on what they call a suicide mission against the British fleet. Their revolt spreads, workers join, cities protest, and just like that, revolution brews in Germany. The Kaiser, who once rode horses and hunted stags, and lectured the world in his porcelain moustache, is told to leave. And he does. He flees to the Netherlands on November 9th. 2 days later, on November 11th, 1918, Germany signs the armistice. The war is over. At exactly 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fall silent. After 4 years of thunder, the silence is terrifying. Birds return to branches. Soldiers, dazed, look around as if waking from a long, shared hallucination. You, sitting in your trench, hear it, the absence, the hush. No bullets, no whistles, just breath. You survived. But the world you return to, that is not the one you left. You would think that once the guns go quiet, peace just walks in, shakes everyone's hand, and unpacks a picnic basket, right? But no, peace, as it turns out, is just as messy, vengeful, and political as the war that came before it. So let's take a breath, careful, still smells like gunpowder, and follow the caravan to Paris, where a different kind of battle begins. One not of bullets and trenches, but of pens, speeches, and rather heated glances across mahogany tables. Welcome to the Versailles Conference. It's 1919 now. Europe is a patchwork of grief and ruins. Empires that once strutted across maps in confident borders are now smoking heaps of national confusion. Austria-Hungary, dissolved. The Ottoman Empire, terminal. Germany, defeated, exhausted, and glaring quietly into its soup. The victors gather in Paris, the Big Four. Woodrow Wilson, representing the United States, with his grand dreams of a better world and his impossibly smug set of 14 points. David Lloyd George, Britain's Prime Minister, caught between punishing Germany and making sure the British Empire remains the world's most polished bully. Georges Clemenceau, the French Premier, whose entire mood could be summarized as Germany must suffer. To be fair, Verdun will do that to a man. And Vittorio Orlando of Italy, who mostly just wants to make sure Italy gets something, anything really, to justify its horrific effort. They argue, they lecture. Wilson gives speeches long enough to age cheese. Clemenceau snarls through his moustache. Lloyd George calculates votes back home. And Orlando? Well, no one really listens to Orlando. But behind the pageantry is a deeper struggle. What should the world look like now? Wilson wants to redraw borders based on self-determination, which sounds noble until you realize that the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires were kaleidoscopes of tangled ethnicities, languages, and ambitions. Drawing fair lines is like trying to untangle Christmas lights in the dark while blindfolded during an earthquake. Meanwhile, France wants revenge. Germany invaded them twice in less than 50 years. They're not feeling generous. They want Germany disarmed, defanged, and billed for every brick and baguette. Britain walks the line, yes to punishment, but not so much that Germany collapses entirely and gives rise to, say, a vengeful man with a tiny moustache and loud opinions. Oh, if only... And Germany? Germany isn't even at the table. They're invited only at the end, when the terms are written and the ink is practically dry. They read the treaty, because here's what the Treaty of Versailles says. Germany must accept full responsibility for the war. All of it. Clause 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. They must pay massive reparations, so massive that future economists will argue they were economically unpayable. They lose territory. Alsace-Lorraine goes back to France. The Polish corridor cuts into their side like a bad tattoo. Their military, capped, no air force, a tiny army, no submarines, no tanks, just whistles and harsh language. It's humiliation on parchment, and worse, Germany signs it, not because they agree, but because they have no choice. Historians still argue whether the treaty was too harsh, just harsh enough, or perhaps even too soft, given the fire it tried to smother. What's clear is this: it leaves Germany angry, bitter, and broke. A dangerous cocktail. Meanwhile, Wilson gets his League of Nations, a global club meant to prevent future wars, solve disputes, and keep humanity's worst instincts in check. There's just one problem. The US Congress doesn't like it. Wilson, in his usual fashion, refused to compromise on the treaty's wording. So Congress, in its usual fashion, says, "Fine, then we won't sign it at all." And they don't. The United States never joins the League. The one person who wanted it most ends up watching from the sidelines. Ironic, of course, effective, not remotely. Elsewhere, the map of Europe becomes a surrealist painting. New nations appear: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Old ones crumble. Everyone's holding referendums like bake sales. The Middle East, well, Britain and France carve it up with rulers and arrogance, creating mandates, protectorates, and a legacy of resentment that will echo into the next century and beyond. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, soon to be known as Atatürk, rises from the Ottoman ashes and says no thanks to the scraps handed out in Versailles. He launches a nationalist revolution and builds a new republic from the bones of empire. In Russia, Lenin consolidates power. A civil war rages between Reds and Whites. And somewhere in a cluttered room in Moscow, a man named Stalin takes notes. Back in Germany, the Weimar Republic begins its shaky life. It's democratic, fragile, and doomed to be blamed for everything. Inflation spikes. Left-wing and right-wing groups clash in the streets. And veterans, disillusioned and jobless, begin listening to radical voices. One of those voices, a bitter corporal who had served in the trenches and didn't take defeat very well. But that can wait. For now, the world breathes. Uneasily, suspiciously, but it breathes. So now peace is technically in the air, except it smells more like burnt treaties and unresolved bitterness than lilacs and justice. You'd think after 4 years of mud, gas, and machine guns, the world might take a nap, maybe enjoy a few decades of blissful quiet. But no, the interwar years don't come with a hammock and herbal tea. They come with protests, economic collapse, and the gnawing sensation that everyone just pressed pause, not stop. Let's begin with Germany, shall we? Picture a country trying to recover from one of the bloodiest wars in history, while simultaneously being blamed for the entire thing, charged billions in reparations, and asked to politely disband its army. It's not a great starting point. The Weimar Republic is technically a democracy, but it's born under a very awkward cloud. See, many Germans don't think their army was defeated. No, they believe the army was stabbed in the back by politicians, pacifists, communists, Jews. Take your pick. This myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, spreads like a cold in a kindergarten. It's not true, of course, but when has that ever stopped a good conspiracy theory? Meanwhile, inflation hits Germany like a drunken elephant. By 1923, The mark is so worthless you could burn bundles of it to heat your house, if only the rent didn't already cost a wheelbarrow of banknotes. People trade in eggs, soap, or if they're fancy, wheel axles, an entire economy built on monopoly money. The Allies, particularly France and Belgium, don't think Germany is paying fast enough, so they occupy the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Germans respond with passive resistance. Coal production plummets. The German economy plummets harder. And in the chaos, extremist voices get louder. Back in the cafes and beer halls of Munich, a frustrated ex-soldier with a toothbrush mustache and enough rage to power a small city begins to rise. But let's keep him in the background for now. We've got more ground to cover. Because Germany isn't the only country wobbling. Austria-Hungary is gone. Like, completely. It's now a buffet table of new nations. Austria itself is reduced to a landlocked shadow, licking the wounds of a vanished empire. Hungary becomes a monarchy without a monarch. Yes, really, briefly ruled by a weird mix of admirals and regents. Czechoslovakia forms, surprisingly functional for a country with 2 names and 3 dozen internal tensions. Yugoslavia pops into existence like a Balkan piñata filled with nationalities that don't particularly like each other. It's a brave experiment in multi-ethnic statehood that, spoiler alert, will not end well. Italy, despite being on the winning side, is furious. They didn't get the territorial gains they were promised. Their economy is in shambles. Soldiers return to find jobs gone, and their sacrifices unappreciated. And into this mess steps Benito Mussolini, who takes fascism from a fringe idea to a marching, saluting, black-shirted movement. He promises strength, order, and that very specific brand of nostalgic nationalism that's only slightly less subtle than a cannon blast. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, or rather, what's left of it, a transformation is underway. Mustafa Kemal, now officially Ataturk, launches a revolution. He defeats invading Greek forces, abolishes the Sultanate, and builds a secular Turkish republic from scratch. Out go the fezzes, in come Latin alphabets, and women's suffrage. The Ottoman dream dies not with a whimper, but with reforms, court trials, and a lot of uncomfortable paperwork. And over in Russia, well, if you thought the Bolsheviks were going to install a peaceful utopia overnight, allow me to introduce you to the Russian Civil War. Red versus white, communists versus tsarists, Democrats, monarchists, and basically anyone with a horse and a gun. The Reds win, eventually, but at the cost of millions of lives and enough destruction to make the Germans look organized. By 1922, the Soviet Union is born, a new kind of empire with red flags, grain quotas, and a 5-year plan for everything, including misery. Lenin, increasingly ill, eyes his comrades warily. One of them, a man named Stalin, smiles a little too often and speaks a little too softly. Back in Western Europe, the 1920s try very hard to forget. The Roaring Twenties, they call them. Jazz, flappers, silent films, and stock markets that refuse to stop rising. It's a party built on loans, speculation, and the belief that nothing bad could possibly happen ever again. Until it does. Because in 1929, the world economy throws itself out the window. The Great Depression begins, not just a financial crisis, but a global earthquake that shakes the very foundations of industry, employment, and confidence. Banks collapse, unemployment soars, breadlines form, people who once owned railroads now sell apples on street corners. And in that vacuum of money, of hope, of direction, something darker stirs. Authoritarianism doesn't march in wearing jackboots at first. It tiptoes in with promises. Promises of revival, of revenge, of greatness. It speaks to the unemployed worker, the bitter veteran, the anxious businessman. Across the world, democracy teeters. Some places, it falls. But the war, our war, the Great War, is still fresh in everyone's minds. They called it the war to end all wars. A charming phrase really, naive, poetic, and tragically incorrect. Because the fire hasn't gone out. It's just smouldering, waiting. By now, you might think the world has learned its lesson, that after 4 years of mechanized carnage, followed by a turbulent decade of revolutions, economic nosedives, and border rearrangements, maybe, just maybe, humanity would look around and say, let's not do that again. But you would be wrong. Because 1930s Europe isn't a calm recovery period. It's more like a slow-motion nervous breakdown, set to the sound of marching boots and radio speeches that get louder each year. The Great War didn't end the old world. It simply shook the snow globe, and now the flakes are settling in very ominous patterns. Let's start where the ripples are becoming waves. Germany. The Weimar Republic, already battered by reparations, inflation, and international embarrassment, now faces the Great Depression. American loans dry up, factories shut down, unemployment soars, the streets fill with angry men in uniforms, brown for the Nazis, red for the communists. The center cannot hold, and into this chaos steps our bitter little friend, Adolf Hitler. A veteran of the trenches, a failed artist, a man with a voice like sandpaper and a talent for weaponizing rage. He's been writing, ranting, organizing. His book, Mein Kampf, isn't just an unhinged manifesto. It's a blueprint, and people are listening. Not just the desperate and jobless, but industrialists, nationalists, and people nostalgic for the days of empire and order. In 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. It happens legally, democratically, which is one of history's least funny jokes. Within months, he consolidates power. The Reichstag fire gives him an excuse. The Enabling Act gives him authority. Political opponents vanish, trade unions dissolve, and the Nazi flag begins fluttering from every building with uncomfortable symmetry. Historians still debate whether the Great War created Hitler or simply cleared the stage for him. But what's clear is this: without 1914 to 1918, no Nazi Germany, no mass appeal for promises of revenge and rebirth. And Germany is not alone in this authoritarian renaissance. In Italy, Mussolini has already been ruling since the early 1920s. Fascism becomes fashionable. Trains supposedly run on time. The press is muzzled. Children are taught to salute before they can read. It's a society obsessed with strength, tradition, and a mythical past that mostly exists in statues. In the Soviet Union, Lenin's death in 1924 opens the door for Stalin, and Stalin does not knock gently. He purges, he imprisons, he industrializes the Soviet Union at a pace that breaks bones and spirits alike. Famine sweeps through Ukraine. The secret police keep neighborhoods in a state of whispering fear, but the 5-year plans roll on, because progress, apparently, must be soaked in suffering. Meanwhile, Japan has its own imperial dreams. The 1930s see Japan turning militaristic, nationalistic, and disturbingly efficient at conquest. They invade Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations, that well-meaning ghost of Versailles, raises a diplomatic eyebrow and then does absolutely nothing. Japan shrugs, leaves the League, and keeps conquering. So we have 3 major players now, leaning toward dictatorship and expansionism. And what's the rest of the world doing? Mostly pretending everything is fine. France builds defensive walls, the Maginot Line, so thick and elaborate they're practically begging someone to just walk around them. Britain, still haunted by memories of the Somme, clings to appeasement like a toddler to a nightlight. And the United States, isolationist to the core. Not our circus, not our war. They mumble as Hitler remilitarizes the Rhineland, Mussolini invades Ethiopia, and Franco launches a civil war in Spain. Ah yes, Spain. It becomes a dress rehearsal for World War II. On one side, Spanish Republicans, supported by leftists, communists, and international brigades of idealists from around the world. On the other, Nationalists, supported by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Cities are bombed. Civilians are targeted. Guernica, immortalized by Picasso, becomes shorthand for what the modern age of war will look like. Not soldiers versus soldiers, but ideology versus everyone else. And while the democracies wring their hands, the authoritarians test weapons, strategies, and resolve. Spoiler, democracy is not looking great in the resolve department. By the late 1930s, Hitler is making moves like a chess player who already knows his opponent won't protest. He absorbs Austria in 1938. Anschluss, they call it. A unification, they say, not an invasion. The world frowns and moves on. Next comes Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region. Hitler demands it. Britain and France panic, so they gather in Munich, pat Hitler on the head, and say fine, but no more. Neville Chamberlain returns to London, declaring peace for our time. Historians still argue whether appeasement was cowardice, pragmatism, or just political denial in a trench coat. But Hitler, he sees it as a green light, because in 1939 he makes a deal that shocks everyone. Germany and the Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact. Yes, you read that right. Nazis and communists shaking hands, agreeing to not invade each other. Why? Because Hitler wants Poland, and Stalin wants time. So they carve up Eastern Europe like a pie, and then on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, airstrikes, tanks, mechanized infantry. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war. And just like that, the Great War gets a sequel. Only this time, the stakes are even higher, the ideologies sharper, the weapons deadlier. And the lesson? Apparently not learned. So here we are again, standing at the edge of the abyss, 1939, and the guns are once more loaded, not just with bullets, but with the weight of history. If the First World War was a tragedy of empires, the second will be a tragedy of ideologies. The uniforms have changed, but the trenches, well, they're just more mobile now. But let's not leap straight into the fire. Let's first glance sideways at what this moment truly means. Because September 1st, 1939 is not just a military invasion. It's a thunderclap that echoes with 20 years of unresolved grief, betrayal, and national pride dressed in paranoia. Hitler's tanks roll into Poland not simply because he wants land, but because Versailles promised him he couldn't have it, and he hates promises. Poland is carved in two, half gobbled up by Germany, half by the Soviet Union, who waltz in from the east like it's a dinner reservation. Nobody likes to talk about that part, by the way, the Soviet invasion. It's not as tidy as the Allied narrative would prefer. But war is rarely tidy. The West, namely Britain and France, issue declarations of war. They print newspapers, they fortify the Maginot Line, and then nothing happens. For months. This curious interlude is known as the phony war, or Sitzkrieg if you're feeling Teutonic. Soldiers wait, citizens hoard. Gas masks are handed out like Halloween candy. The world holds its breath. Paris cafes are still open. British children are evacuated to the countryside, more out of anxiety than need. And then, in April 1940, the quiet ends. Germany invades Denmark and Norway. Quick, efficient, terrifying. Denmark folds in hours. Norway fights, but it's a lost cause. Why Norway, you ask? Well, iron ore, and a coast full of juicy naval access. War, it turns out, is rarely about ideology at the start. It's logistics wrapped in flags. The Western Front follows in May. This time, Hitler doesn't bother with drawn-out trench warfare. He remembers what bogged them down last time, and instead opts for a high-speed punch, blitzkrieg. Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg fall like dominoes. The Maginot Line, Germany sidesteps it, goes right through the Ardennes forest, because apparently the French believed tanks were afraid of trees. Then comes the sickening slide into France. Paris isn't defended like it was in 19. French morale collapses, civilians flee. A German column marches down the Champs-Élysées. This time no horse-drawn carriages, just panzer tanks, and flags with too many angles. In June 1940, France surrenders. Hitler stages a photo op at the exact railway carriage where the 1918 armistice was signed. Petty, oh absolutely, but also deeply symbolic. This is revenge served cold, polished, and with goose-stepping choreography. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Britain stands alone. Well, not entirely alone. The Empire is still there, for now. But on the continent, it's just them. And this is where you get that infamous defiance. Churchill's growl over the radio, Spitfires screaming through the skies, Londoners calmly sipping tea in bomb shelters. The Battle of Britain begins, an aerial campaign where Germany hopes to bomb Britain into submission. Spoiler, it doesn't work. British radar, resilience, and an aviation industry working overtime make sure of that. German bombers suffer heavy losses, the Luftwaffe loses its momentum, and perhaps most importantly, Britain gains a much-needed moral victory. And then things take a truly stomach-turning turn. Operation Barbarossa. In June 1941, Hitler betrays Stalin and invades the Soviet Union. Yes, after carving up Poland together and exchanging awkward Christmas cards, Germany launches the largest land invasion in history against its temporary comrade, because in the end, Hitler never viewed the USSR as a partner, just another enemy to be crushed under steel tracks and ideological purity. At first, it works. German forces sweep across the plains of Eastern Europe, taking Ukraine, reaching the gates of Moscow. Soviet troops are poorly prepared, still reeling from Stalin's purges, which conveniently executed most of his competent generals. But the Soviet Union doesn't die. It freezes, starves, retreats, but it doesn't die. And by winter, German troops are stuck. No winter uniforms, no plan for a long campaign. Moscow doesn't fall. Instead, it buries its enemies in snow and silence. Meanwhile, on another side of the planet, a new player enters. It's December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japan, hoping to secure its dominance in the Pacific, attacks the US naval base in Hawaii. It's meant to be a knockout punch, crippling American naval power before it can interfere in Japanese ambitions. Instead, it's a wake-up call. The United States, isolationist no more, declares war. And thus what was once a European conflict becomes a world war in earnest. The Allies are formed: Britain, the USSR, the USA, and others. The Axis tightens: Germany, Italy, Japan, and the war grows teeth everywhere. North Africa sees desert warfare. Rommel, the desert fox, clashes with Montgomery. Tank battles rage under the blistering sun. Cities in Britain, Germany, and Japan face nightly air raids that level homes, schools, and anything foolish enough to stand upright. And back in the occupied territories, something even darker begins: the Holocaust. It's not just about death camps, though they come, and with horrifying efficiency. It begins with ghettos, forced labor, starvation, then mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, who follow behind German armies and erase entire communities, and then the final solution, an industrialized genocide that leaves 6 million Jews murdered, along with millions of others, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners. It is the true abyss of the war, not a battlefield, but a system, cold, bureaucratic, and unspeakably cruel. So here we are, in the thick of World War II, and everything that World War I failed to prevent has now arrived, wearing a new uniform, but carrying the same unbearable weight, all because 20 years ago the world thought it had ended war by simply saying it was over. It hadn't. It had only lit the fuse. Now that the world has fully ignited like a carelessly handled chemistry set, we step into the heart of the inferno. The years 1942 and 1943 are the pivot point when the tide begins to turn, but not without dragging millions through fire and frost first. If the first phase of the war was about conquest and blitz, this middle act is about attrition, desperation, and survival with a grimace. Let's begin in the East. The Eastern Front, by now, has grown so vast and blood-soaked that it might as well be its own planet. And on this freezing planet of misery stands a city, Stalingrad. Now, Hitler could have gone for the oil fields directly, could have starved the Soviets of resources, but no, he wanted the city with Stalin's name on it, a symbolic prize, a psychological victory. So in summer 1942, the German Sixth Army marches toward it like moths to a frozen Soviet-shaped flame. And what follows is one of the most horrific sieges in history. Imagine buildings reduced to bones, streets filled with snipers, basements doubling as both shelters and graves. Combat devolves into house-to-house brutality. German soldiers nickname the railway station the Fountain of Death. They take it in the morning, lose it by night, then try again tomorrow, over and over. The Soviets, meanwhile, bleed but never break. Reinforcements sneak in under cover of night across the Volga River, which might as well be a liquid graveyard, and then when the Germans are overextended, freezing and dangerously confident, the Soviets counterattack. They don't just push, they encircle. It's a trap, and the Germans don't even realize it until it snaps shut. Entire divisions cut off, supplies gone, temperatures drop to levels that make your bones apologize. Hitler forbids retreat, the Sixth Army holds out, and then it dies. Stalingrad is a turning point. It shatters the myth of German invincibility. It tells the world, and especially the Germans, you can be beaten. Meanwhile, over in North Africa, another reversal unfolds. The Allies, under British General Bernard Montgomery and American General Dwight Eisenhower, begin squeezing Axis forces like a poorly sealed toothpaste tube. The Africa Corps, led by Rommel, the Desert Fox, fights valiantly, but logistics and numbers aren't on his side. By 1943, Axis troops in Tunisia surrender. The Mediterranean is open. Next stop, Italy. Italy. You remember them, right? Mussolini's marching parades and sharp uniforms? Well, by 1943, Italy's had enough of war and of Benito. The Allies invade Sicily. Italian morale collapses. Mussolini is arrested by his own people in what is possibly the least glamorous end for a man who once fancied himself Caesar 2.0. He's rescued briefly by German paratroopers, only to be later captured and executed by partisans, strung up like meat in a Milan square. Not quite the empire he envisioned. Italy surrenders, but don't cheer yet. The Germans simply march in and take over northern Italy. So the fighting continues, mountain by mountain, with Allied troops dragging themselves up the spine of the Apennines, while German forces dig in. Meanwhile, in the air, things change dramatically. The Allies embrace the skies like never before. The US and Britain launch relentless bombing campaigns over Germany. The theory: break industrial capacity and morale in one flaming swoop. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden become infernos. Firestorms consume whole neighborhoods. Historians still debate whether it was necessary, effective, or just state-sanctioned arson at scale. Back on the ground, the Soviets are now on the offensive. After Stalingrad, they begin pushing westward. Each step is costly, villages erased, rivers soaked with history. But the Red Army grows stronger, more experienced, more vengeful. In July 1943, the Battle of Kursk erupts, one of the largest tank battles in history. Over 6,000 tanks clash in the Russian countryside. It's less war as chess and more war as two rhinos in a phone booth. But the Soviets hold. They push back. And from that moment, Germany's dream of Eastern conquest begins to rot. And while the Axis falters, the Allies start thinking bigger. It's 1943, and high-level meetings, code-named and clandestine, plot a grand strategy. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin form the Big Three. They don't always agree. Stalin wants a second front in Europe now, while Roosevelt balances public opinion and Churchill clings to imperial interests. But they agree on this: total victory, unconditional surrender, no Versailles-style wishy-washiness. This time, the war ends when the enemy can't get up again. In the Pacific, the US begins its island-hopping campaign against Japan. Places you've never heard of become blood-soaked legends. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. The jungle is relentless, the heat unbearable, and the enemy fights to the last breath. But island by island, the Americans inch closer to the Japanese mainland. And back home, on every home front, the war is total. Factories work around the clock. Women build bombers. Children collect scrap metal. Ration books become currency. In the US, internment camps round up Japanese Americans in a paranoid fever. In the UK, cities black out to hide from bombers. In the USSR, entire towns uproot themselves to stay one step ahead of the Wehrmacht. Everyone is fighting. Everyone is paying. And everyone knows, though few say it, that this war has become something more than territory or treaties. It's existential now. A conflict not just between nations, but between visions of the future. Democracy versus dictatorship. Freedom versus fascism. Survival versus annihilation. And the outcome? Still uncertain. By 1944, the storm clouds no longer just hang overhead. They explode across every front, every coast, every breath of wind. The war is no longer about winning, it's about finishing, and everyone involved is counting the days, the bullets, and the body bags. So let's zoom in on the West. The Allies, Britain, America, Canada, and the free remnants of occupied nations have spent years preparing for one monumental act, the liberation of Western Europe. The name? Operation Overlord. You know it as D-Day. June 6, 1944. At dawn, over 150,000 troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in what is still the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The sea churns with landing craft, the sky darkens with paratroopers, and the cliffs of France echo with gunfire, chaos and decisions made in seconds that will be studied for centuries. 5 beaches, code names that sound like football plays. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. At Omaha, American troops are cut down en masse by machine gun fire from fortified German positions. At Juno, Canadians push through knee-deep water and mines. The entire coast is a killing field, but they push on. By nightfall, the Allies hold the beaches. It is the beginning of the end. But don't mistake it for a swift path to victory. From Normandy to Paris is not a gentle stroll, it's a crawl through hedgerows, farmhouses rigged with booby traps, and ambushes in every apple orchard. The Allies are stronger, but Germany is still vicious, especially now, knowing that defeat is not just possible, it's probable. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union begins its own thunderclap, Operation Bagration. If the Western Front is a scalpel, Bagration is a sledgehammer. Soviet forces unleash a coordinated attack that obliterates the German Army Group center. Entire divisions vanish into the marshes of Belarus. Towns are liberated, but at unimaginable cost. Each mile retaken feels more like exorcism than conquest. Historians still debate whether Bagration or D-Day did more to break the back of Nazi Germany, but in truth it's the pressure from both sides, the pincer closing, that finally squeezes the Reich into retreat. And in Italy, the Allies continue their slow ascent northward. Rome is liberated in June 1944, just 2 days before D-Day. But the fighting doesn't end. German troops dig into the mountains. Every ridge is another Alamo, every valley a trap. The Italian campaign, often overshadowed, is brutal and relentless. And back home, the mood is different now. The propaganda posters are still up. Yes, loose lips sink ships, keep calm and carry on. But behind the slogans is fatigue. Rationing is normal. Bomb shelters are routine. Families have lost sons, brothers, entire generations. And for the first time, people begin to whisper, when will it really end? Meanwhile, in Germany, fear replaces confidence. The Allies bomb cities day and night. Hamburg burns. Dresden is turned to ash in a firestorm so hot it melts pavement. Historians still argue whether this was necessary or merely vengeance wrapped in policy, but the aim is clear: break the will to fight. In concentration camps, the final solution continues with chilling precision, but cracks begin to form. Prisoners resist. Camps are abandoned as the Soviets approach. Liberating forces discover the unimaginable: piles of bodies, gas chambers, starvation incarnate. And with these discoveries comes a new purpose, not just defeating fascism, but exposing its full horror. In the Pacific, the war takes a darker turn still. The island-hopping campaign intensifies. Each victory is bloodier than the last. The Japanese refuse surrender, embracing suicide tactics like banzai charges and kamikaze pilots. American soldiers, hardened and weary, push forward anyway. In late 1944, they retake the Philippines. General MacArthur wades ashore dramatically. I have returned, but the cost is immense. Thousands die for each stretch of beach. Civilians are caught in the crossfire, burned alive in cities like Manila. And now, as winter 1944 sets in, Hitler makes one last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge. In the Ardennes forest, under the cover of snow and surprise, German forces smash into American lines. It's a blitz reminiscent of 1940, and for a moment it works. American troops are surrounded in Bastogne. Supplies dwindle. The weather is merciless, but they hold. General Patton reroutes his army with improbable speed. Reinforcements break through. The bulge recedes, and with it, Germany's last real hope of turning the tide. Now Germany is bleeding from every direction. In the east, the Soviets have reached Poland. They see the camps. They burn with vengeance. Berlin is within reach. In the west, the Allies push through France, into Belgium, and toward the Rhine. Cities fall one by one. And inside Germany, bombs fall daily. The people hide. The cities are rubble. The economy is collapsed. The dreams of empire have turned into a funeral procession. But Hitler, he digs in, literally. In his Berlin bunker, he rants plans and sends ghost armies into fantasy campaigns. His generals know it's over. Some try to assassinate him, like Claus von Stauffenberg in the July 20 plot, but fail. So the war drags on, even when it's lost. And the world, holding its breath one final time, prepares for the crescendo. It's April 1945. The world stands at the precipice, toes curled over the edge, gazing down into the pit that was once Europe. The fighting has not stopped, but the final act has begun. You can feel it in the wind, thick with smoke, with ash, with a silence that doesn't feel like peace, but something much heavier. Let's start in the east. The Red Army has crossed the Oder River. Berlin is within artillery range. The Soviets do not march. They surge with fury, grief, and vengeance. The memory of Stalingrad burns in every soldier's heart. Entire units are forged from survivors of German occupation, and what they carry is not just weapons, it's retribution. They fight street by street, building by building. Berlin becomes a wailing graveyard of cement and fire. Civilians hide in basements. Children scurry past snipers. The German military, fractured and cornered, throws everything into defense, including teenagers and old men. The Hitler Youth, armed with bazookas too heavy for their arms, try to stop tanks with dreams of dying for a crumbling cause. And in the Führer bunker beneath the rubble of Berlin, Adolf Hitler writes his final orders. He marries Eva Braun in a surreal ceremony, more mausoleum than matrimony. Hours later, they take their lives. Their bodies are burned as per instructions. The bunker does not erupt in chaos. It sinks into a sort of desperate silence. Around them, Germany surrenders by degrees, first in pieces, then all at once. May 7, 1945, Germany signs unconditional surrender. May 8, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe is over. Church bells ring, crowds flood into the streets from London to New York. Strangers kiss, flags wave. But the joy is complicated. Behind every celebration is absence, a son who won't come home, a city that no longer exists, a future that still feels unsure. But we're not done, because the war continues in the Pacific. The defeat of Nazi Germany does not slow the Japanese. In fact, their resistance intensifies. American forces inch closer to the Japanese homeland, island by island. Each conquest grows bloodier. Okinawa, the last major island before the Japanese mainland, becomes a nightmare of cliffs, caves, and fanatical defense. Over 200,000 casualties. Civilians leap from cliffs rather than surrender. Kamikaze pilots dive by the hundreds. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who led the U.S. through 12 years of depression and war, dies in April. His successor, Harry Truman, inherits not only a global conflict, but a secret, the Manhattan Project. Because deep in the New Mexico desert, a weapon has been forged, unlike any other. Not a bomb, a miniature sun, a device designed not just to destroy armies, but to end wars. On August 6, 1945, that sun is unleashed over Hiroshima. 3 days later, over Nagasaki. And just like that, 2 cities vanish in minutes, tens of thousands killed instantly, more by radiation, fire, collapse. The world sees a power so absolute, it frightens even its creators. Scientists weep, generals stare blankly. Oppenheimer quotes the Bhagavad Gita, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." August 15th, 1945, Japan surrenders. September 2 saw the official ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. The Second World War is over. 75 million dead, whole continents scarred, empires dissolved, families scattered, new borders drawn, old ones erased, and perhaps most significantly, 2 new superpowers rise from the rubble, the United States and the Soviet Union. The age of empire ends, the age of ideology begins, and the rest of the world? Shell-shocked, cautious, hoping for peace, while already planning for the next conflict. Because now there are atomic bombs, Cold War ideologies, and a deep awareness that another global war might mean the end of civilization itself. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the soldiers, those who return. They come home to parades, yes, but also to nightmares. Many can't speak about what they've seen. Some don't want to. Others find that home doesn't feel like home anymore. Women who ran factories are asked to return to kitchens. Whole cities are rebuilt in concrete and apology. And for those liberated from camps, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, the end of the war doesn't mean the end of suffering. Displaced persons camps rise across Europe. Many survivors find they have no homes, no families, no countries to return to. The Holocaust, revealed in full, becomes more than atrocity. It becomes a scar on the soul of the world. And yet, there is hope. The United Nations is formed in October. 9 nations promise never again. Trials in Nuremberg hold the architects of genocide accountable. At least some of them. Words like genocide and crimes against humanity become codified, not just whispered. The The world, teetering on the edge of extinction, decides to try something different. But peace, as always, is complicated. The Cold War brews. Colonial revolts simmer. Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, they await their turns on history's bloodied stage. Yet, for a brief moment, after 6 years of apocalypse, the guns go silent, and silence, real, aching silence, returns to the earth. The war has ended, but the story, as ever, continues. And now, with the final shot fired and the treaties signed, you stand at the edge of history's largest wound, staring into its healing but not healed scar. The war is over, yes, but peace? Peace is not the absence of gunfire. Peace is paperwork, trials, trauma, triumph laced with guilt. It's a fragile balance of relief and reckoning. And so our story eases into its closing act, not with an exclamation, but with the exhale of a world that barely survived itself. Let's begin with the reckoning. The Nuremberg trials commence in late. For the first time in human history, leaders of a nation are held accountable for war crimes by an international tribunal. Not vengeance, justice, or at least the attempt at it. Nazi officials sit behind glass, stone-faced. They hear the charges: genocide, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity. And for the world watching, something extraordinary happens. Not just punishment, but articulation. The horrors are given names. Systems are revealed. Documents, films, survivor testimonies. These become the evidence, not just of guilt, but of what humanity allowed itself to become. Not all the guilty are caught, of course. Some escape. Some are shielded. Some vanish into new lives with new passports. History, as always, is only partially complete. And then there is the question of division. Europe, once one battlefield, is now two ideologies. The West rebuilds with American help. The Marshall Plan floods Europe with dollars, concrete, and Coca-Cola. The idea? Prosperity prevents another Hitler. The result? Western Europe booms. Skyscrapers rise. Jeans replace uniforms. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe becomes a buffer zone, liberated by the Red Army, then quietly absorbed into the Soviet sphere. Germany itself is split, not just metaphorically, but literally, cut into East and West. Berlin, once the jewel of a nation, is divided too, and so the Iron Curtain falls. Not with a bang, but a bureaucratic sigh. Japan too is transformed, not occupied with vengeance, but with reinvention. General MacArthur oversees the rebuilding. A new constitution is drafted. Militarism is outlawed. Emperor Hirohito, once divine, is reduced to ceremonial status. Tokyo becomes a laboratory of American ideals. In both cases, Germany and Japan, the post-war years become a strange contradiction, from enemies to economic partners, from ruins to rebirth, and all under the watchful eye of a new global referee, the United States. The US, untouched by war on its soil and armed with a nuclear monopoly, emerges as a superpower. Its economy surges, its culture spreads, its military bases multiply like insurance offices. But beneath the victory there's a tension, because the other superpower, the Soviet Union, is not interested in being second. The Cold War begins not with a war cry, but a whisper: espionage, propaganda, arms races, ideological proxy battles, in places whose names Americans cannot yet pronounce. Meanwhile, the soldiers return home, some to parades, some to silence, many with invisible wounds, what we now call PTSD, but back then was shell shock, or more cruelly, weakness. Veterans find new homes through the GI Bill. They go to college, build suburbs, invent rock and roll, but in their dreams the war marches on. And the Holocaust survivors, they scatter across the globe, some to new countries, some to the newly formed State of Israel in 1948, a homeland born from ashes. But the trauma doesn't end, it transforms into memory, into testimony, into silence, into art. The war's technological innovations, radar, jet engines, antibiotics, nuclear energy reshape the world. Science, once a tool of death, becomes a tool of progress, or so we hope. The United Nations is formed in the ashes of the League of Nations, a new attempt to make war not just unthinkable, but undoable. It's idealistic, often ineffective, but it exists, a place to argue instead of annihilate. And for the next 50 years, the world operates under one truth: never again. But that truth frays. Wars erupt. Korea, Vietnam, Algeria, Palestine, the Congo. Genocides occur. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia. Each time the world says, we must learn. Each time the lessons come late. Historians still argue whether World War II made the world safer or simply more complicated, whether the atomic age prevented total war or ensured that the next one would be the last. But in quieter places, other legacies take root. In books written by survivors, in documentaries watched by grandchildren, in school children walking through Auschwitz with wide eyes and soft steps, in whispered prayers, in grandparents' long silences, in statues and memorials and museum exhibits where visitors exit blinking, not from the light, but from something inside that has shifted. And tonight, as you lie there, perhaps with your own city quiet around you, you can trace the lines of this story, not just through geography or dates, but through the very fabric of your world. Every passport, every plane flight, every human rights campaign, every late-night peace treaty drafted in Geneva, they all carry echoes of 1939, because this war wasn't just an event. It was a transformation, a rupture in time. A mirror held up to the face of humanity, and what we saw wasn't victory or heroism, but a question: can we do better? That question, whispered from the ruins, still waits for an answer. You wake up in a world no longer measured in bombs, but in blueprints. The war is over, yes, but the consequences, the echoes, the aftershocks, oh no, they're just beginning. Because what happens after the war is sometimes even more complex than the war itself. A global exhale, yes, but also a long collective shudder. This is Reconstruction, baby, and it's more than bricks and treaties. It's psyches, borders, alliances, futures, some brighter, some barely holding their shape. Let's take a step into 1946 and what came next. First, the physical devastation. Cities like Warsaw, Stalingrad, Berlin, Hiroshima, they're not just damaged, they're undone. Imagine streets without buildings, neighborhoods without names, entire towns that exist only as ghost stories. People return if they return, to find homes vaporized, loved ones missing, or worse, entire countries are stitched back together with more hope than concrete. Then there's Europe, once the center of the world, now a weakened continent, kept upright by foreign aid and faint memory. The US offers the Marshall Plan, a financial intravenous drip to get Europe walking again, and not out of charity, out of fear, because if the West doesn't feed these broken economies, the East will, and by East we mean Stalin. Oh yes, Uncle Joe. The Soviet Union exits the war with the highest casualties, more than 20 million dead, and a paranoia that's practically radioactive. What does Stalin do? He tightens his grip. He builds a buffer of satellite states. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, not conquered lands per se, but liberated territories, where liberation wears jackboots. Churchill even coins a term in 1946, the Iron Curtain. It's not just metaphor, it's policy. An ideological curtain dividing East from West, democracy and capitalism versus communism and control. A wall of words, soon to become an actual wall of concrete and barbed wire. But while the Cold War begins to settle in like a long, awkward dinner party, no one wants to leave. Another great reckoning is underway: decolonization. World War II didn't just end the Third Reich, it cracked the shell of every empire. Why? Because the contradiction was too obvious. How could Britain preach liberty while still controlling India? How could France defend democracy while clinging to Algeria? The colonies heard the war propaganda, read the pamphlets, saw white men bleed. They saw their chance, and they took it. India gains independence in 1947. A massive, messy partition follows. Millions migrate, violence erupts, new nations are born in blood, India and Pakistan. It's a miracle and a tragedy. Elsewhere in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, flags begin to change colour. The old order crumbles, replaced by something new, something uncertain. And speaking of the uncertain, let's talk about Israel. In 1948, following years of Jewish immigration, much of it driven by the Holocaust, the State of Israel is declared, and instantly war erupts. Arab nations reject the declaration. Palestinians are displaced. Conflict begins that, well, hasn't exactly been resolved. Historians still argue whether the post-war world was a moral victory or a strategic reshuffle, whether the Allies learned to be better or just better organized. Meanwhile, the US and USSR enter an arms race that feels less like national defense and more like two kids on a playground yelling "I dare you" while building increasingly ridiculous weapons. The Cold War won't be fought like the last one. It's not about trenches, it's about ideas. Propaganda, proxy wars, espionage, Cuba, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Little flashpoints with big stakes. And behind it all, the mushroom cloud humming softly. The atomic bomb becomes more than a weapon. It becomes the boogeyman of a new era. People build bunkers. Schools conduct duck and cover drills. There are board games for surviving nuclear fallout, because if there's one thing humans are good at, it's monetizing existential dread. But even amid this tension, the world moves forward. Inventions bloom from wartime innovations, computers, space exploration, medicine, jet travel. Societies evolve, civil rights movements blossom, feminism expands, rock and roll rises from the rubble, electric and unapologetic. Youth culture breaks from the past, dancing on the graves of dictators and doctrines. And yet, the war never really leaves. It haunts the edges of every decision. It whispers through every veteran's dream. It's built into the design of your modern airport, your passport, your morning coffee's origin story. It's the reason your grandparents don't talk about certain years. World War II changed how we govern, how we live, how we fear. It taught us how fast civilization can unravel, but also how it can be stitched back together with patience, pain, and perhaps a little grace. And now, standing here in this twilight between war and peace, you're left with the strangest truth of all. The world that ended in 1945 is the world you're still living in. You've wandered far, my dear Emperor, through fire and frost, trenches and treaties, revolutions and radio broadcasts. And now you find yourself here at the last page of this long, relentless chronicle, the final ember of the war that remade the world. So let's pause not to summarize because you've lived the details, but to tilt the lens and ask, what did it all mean? Because World War II wasn't just a war. It was a mirror, a cracked, burning mirror held up to the face of humanity. And what we saw wasn't pretty, but it was real. We saw that ordinary people, mothers, farmers, barbers, could be turned into monsters by the right lie whispered long enough. We saw that technology could accelerate not just progress but cruelty, that good intentions could coexist with bad outcomes, that courage can be found in the most unlikely places, and cruelty in the most trusted faces. But we also saw something else, that people rebuild. They plant gardens in bomb craters. They write poems about ruins. They take black and white photographs of newborns against backdrops of cities still smoking. They create symphonies out of silence, meaning out of madness, humor out of horror. We're strange creatures like that, resilient, ridiculous and occasionally radiant. Take a moment to consider how much was lost, not just lives, but languages, lullabies, family recipes, small jokes whispered at candlelit tables, childhoods, entire lineages gone in a blink. And yet, somehow, the human story carried on. That's the part they don't teach you in school. They'll give you the numbers, the treaties, the military tactics, but they won't always tell you what it felt like to come home and find your street turned to dust, or to see a friend's name on a telegram instead of in your address book, or to wake up in 1946 and realize that the world had ended and you were now expected to build a new one. And you know what? We did. Not perfectly, not without scars, but we did. And every day since then, through the Cold War, the moon landing, civil rights, pop music, the internet, you have lived in the wake of that rebuilding. The choices your grandparents made shaped the architecture of your present. Their fears became your laws. Their bravery became your comforts. Their silence became your history books. But this isn't just about the past. It's about what kind of world you are helping shape right now. Because history, dear listener, isn't something you watch. It's something you're part of. Even as you lay there, eyelids soft, letting this story lull you into the gentle fog between memory and sleep, you are part of it. You carry the echoes. You continue the questions. You dream the next chapter. So sleep now, under the quilt of a complicated past. Let the names blur. Let the tanks fade into clouds. Let the marching boots become distant thunder. You've earned your rest. And as you drift, may you carry with you one simple, quiet truth. History is heavy, yes, but you are light enough to carry it forward.